down a little bit.
Well, acoustic feedback is a powerful thing. Very good. But you didn't need convincing on that. Well, welcome to our second day here at Yosemite. We have a fabulous lineup for you today. We begin today's theme by moving on to topics in brain dynamics, featuring this morning's speaker, Scott Makeig. Scott Makeig is from the Institute for Computational Neuroscience and Schwartz Center for Computational Neuroscience at UC San Diego. Scott Makeig has sort of reinvented the way we look at EEG and brain dynamics over the years through his work on independent component analysis, which has really taken the world of looking at brain dynamics by storm. Scott has also been in parallel interested in music. In fact, he actually has a formal background in music. He's actually done work on it several years ago, and in recent years he's turned his interest back to music. For that, we're very, very happy. And today he's going to talk about how his study of brain dynamics has informed the sciences of music, movement, and emotion. So please give a warm welcome to Scott Makeig.
Does that work? Excuse me. So, yes, thank you, Ramesh, and for organizing such a wonderful event. And it's the first music conference I've been to in 30 years. Juan Roederer organized the ones I went to in the 80s. But I'm very happy to come back because, as Ramesh said, my interest in the music is, could you turn this? It's getting some feedback. My interest in music has remained and continues, and in fact increases recently. In terms of my own personal life and practice of music. And I've been able also to turn the techniques we've developed in the laboratory to a few music projects, which I hope are the beginning of more music projects in the future. If I'm so lucky to find young partners who want to take it on with me. Oh, I can use this. Okay, so I put together an ambitious talk. We'll see if we get through it all. First, I want to focus on something nearest and dearest to my heart in terms of music, and that is affect, or feeling, or emotion. If you ask almost anyone why they like music, they say it gives you a good feeling. And so, how does it give you a good feeling? I don't have an experiment to report, a recent experiment to report on that, but I want to bring my point of view to you, and we can do a little thought experiment ourselves, and then we'll begin on how it's possible nowadays to use brain dynamics and conveniently and rather cheaply EEG brain dynamics to investigate how the brain supports our experience of music. So what is EEG will have to come first because it's not clear. EEG, how do you use EEG to study affect or affective perception? Can you combine the study of EEG with a study of movement? And then I'll show a recent project in the lab where we combined all four of these elements together. So first of all, a little poem. I call this a prose poem about what is cognitive neuroscience. I call myself a cognitive neuroscientist. And it's entitled Embodied Agency, which I think expresses our ordinary consciousness pretty well in the world. Brain processes have evolved in function to optimize the outcome of the behavior the brain organizes in response to perceived challenges and opportunities. Brains meet the challenge of the moment. And it's this challenge of the moment which is ever changing, and the opportunities of the moment which are ever changing, that makes the brain, our brain, so complex. Because the challenges and opportunities we face are so complex. So there's a continual cycle of perception, action, evaluation that's going on in your brain and my brain. Action may be inaction as well. Or I think probably, I suspect that probably that is not an accurate statement either. It's not just one cycle of perception, action and evaluation that's going on, but many such cycles simultaneously. We believe that we're conscious of what our brain is doing, but of course we know that that's far from the whole truth. And it's because of this continual dynamics that are occurring in response to both our internal and our external challenges and opportunities that studying brain dynamics is so complex. Just simply averaging across many instances is not sufficient to understand the brain dynamics as they unfold in the moment. And so it's the recent advances both in signal coding, but mainly in signal processing and information theory and machine learning that will make it possible, and increasingly make it possible to model the complex brain dynamics that we can record now easily. And by the way, David, this is where fun lies. Fun is in my philosophy as well. More generally, opportunities, of course, relate to the reward axis. So musical affect. How does music convey affect? This is a beautiful, it must have been from a Shaker community or something. Music washes away from the soul the dust of everyday life. Beautiful poetic message. Well, what does it mean? I think it means, my interpretation is that it means that when we listen to music, we enter into this affective mode of perception. And we have to let go. To do that, we have to let go to the analytic mode of perception, where we are constantly in everyday life making decisions based on objective evaluation of our environment. So how does music do this? Well, of course, it does it based on, as our speaker yesterday said, based on biology. So this was a wonderful study I found when I was beginning my PhD, or trying to complete it. It was by Charles Myers from the Cambridge Psychological Laboratory in 1922. It was a scientific experiment, and you could tell that because he said he used a laboratory quality Victrola to play his stimuli to his subjects. The stimuli were like classical orchestral pieces. And he simply asked them, this was before behaviorism, this was introspection, was fair game in psychology. He simply asked them what they experienced after they listened to this music. He asked them to listen to music, and then he asked them, what did you experience? And it's a really nice article, because I thought it covered very well. It failed to narrow and limit the subject of music psychology or music perception to some sort of objective narrow window in which subjects make correct or incorrect psychophysical judgments. he said, in fact, very few people said anything about the music at all when they talked about their experience. These were, as he calls it, the technician. And the technicians seemed to suppress any other aspects of their experience. They only talked about the horns and the modulation and whatever. Nobody other than the technicians actually said anything about the music at all when they were asked to describe their experience. The main aspect was what he calls here in the program, associations. People experienced whole scenes, they experienced whole imaginations. Now, of course, the music he used probably drove them that. It was programmatic music, something like film music today, and then overtures to operas and so on. But people experience, this is all instrumental music, no words. They experienced whole scenes, whole fantasies. They saw things, they imagined things. This is the most common. And then, of course, some people focused on what he calls the intrapersonal aspect, or the intrasubjective aspect. And they spoke about the expression of human character. Character is a lovely word we've lost, pretty much, I think, today, in the sense that it used to be used. A character, what is a person's character? It was always tied, most always tied to moral character. What is their moral character? What is the character? Is the person noble? Is the person generous? Is the person inspired? Is the person? So this ability to communicate the human character, which means human feeling quality, is what some people, or quite a few people in his group, it's how they describe their experience. I experienced human character. I experienced noble feelings. I experienced grief. I experienced awe. And he said these included, many of the connoisseurs of music. And then he does mention at the end that there's occasionally there are reports of mystical experiences engendered by music that we can't discount because in fact, there was a nice poster last night about people in self-inducing trance by listening to drumming. So this is the stuff of musical experience, I would say, because this is actually what people. We can't discount anything that they say here because this is what people actually do say about their experience of music. So now, how do we experience? Why is it that we can experience human character and emotion in music? I think my theory is the basic fact is what I might call theory not of mind but of heart. Psychologists often, have used, psychologists of emotion have often used such pictures, and shown that, people who are severely challenged in affective perception, perhaps autistics, have a hard time saying, which one is happy and which one is sad. But everyone else, of course, these are over the top, blatant expressions of emotion. To discern the feelings of another person in real life, though, and therefore, of course, their motivation to act and their intent, we must typically use much more subtle cues. There's also good reasons for our people, as well as animals in the animal kingdom, to hide their emotions. So, all of us with pets know this sort of feeling where animals very carefully regulate their expression of feeling toward each other for also good reasons. But of course, in human society, the same is true. These are pictures that came up when I put in inscrutable into Google. So how is it? So it's very often very difficult and we must use really subtle cues to discern what other people are feeling. So that means our brain machinery for using those cues, picking up on it and using those cues, although it's almost not conscious, must be very elaborate. And it's probably very much understudied in contemporary brain imaging. So look at this picture. Beautiful picture I found on the web. And just think to yourself, look at the feeling aspect that you can perceive between these two people. This is a real life. This is not actors. This is a professional photography of a psychotherapy session, a family counseling session. Now ask yourself, what visual cues are you getting? What do you base that strong feeling that you can get from this picture about what these people are feeling? How do you know what this woman is feeling from her face? Is it the way, we don't know really. We're not aware, but we were able to perceive very directly the feelings of others. And it's quite difficult. Of course, we don't know these people. We don't know the real story. But we certainly can have strong feelings about what the story must be. And it's this ability, honed through evolution, to explore the feelings of others that I believe creates in us the capacity to experience art and to experience music, and to experience through music and art human feelings. So now I'm going to jump to a browser window in which I have queued up an interesting stimulus. This was famous in psychology in the 1940s. And you see the technology at the time to create an animation. And the psychologist involved wanted to show that seeing even the simplest shapes move around, one simultaneously creates these associations of human character, personalities, and interactions. And I don't know if this has been shown in psychology departments recently, but there it is on YouTube. So what is the story? See, it's immediately out. Very easiest for us to fit into, to sort of fall into that affective mode of perception, where we experience movements of these shapes as interactions, emotionally charged interactions between humans, between human beings. We're doing what when we do that, we're doing what the people listening to the music did in Meyer's experiment. So I did an experiment during my dissertation years. I was on perception of mistuned octaves, in tune and mistuned octaves. And I, of course, used a laboratory quality VAX computer to make these sounds. They were in that range, but they weren't harmonic octaves. They didn't have any roughness associated with them. They were melodic. Boom, boom. They were up and down, and they were mistuned very slightly and very systematically. And then I had pieces of paper, no PCs, and I had the graduate music students fill out for each of these two tones, boom, boom, they heard whether, first of all, they were in tune, the octave was in tune, the second note was in tune, and second, whether the second note, if not, was it sharp or flat. And so for the intuneness judgment, so they had two columns. They just went in tune, not sharp or flat. Not very much in tune, a little sharp. You know, so. Now from a physics point of view, given that you judge this interval as is, let's say, 1214 cents, both those answers fall out from that one fact, right? So from physics point of view, pitch difference, pitch ratio, is a one-dimensional system. But what I got in the experiment was that the in-tuneness judgment here really centered almost on 1200 cents, just as had been reported by other psychophysicists. The people tended to like the octave stretched a little bit. But when I asked them whether it was the second note was sharp or flat, they had a very pronounced tendency to, I felt, to say that the second note wasn't sharp. This suggested to me that when we asked these two questions, when these subjects were asking themselves these two questions, they relied on different streams of perception. They were actually using different modes of perception to answer different aspects of the same question. They were not consulting a slide rule that had 1214 on it to answer both questions. So what I did was I tried an exploratory experiment. I said, now imagine these two tones don't represent, are actually, they represent the following story, just like those little squares and triangles. Imagine that the first tone represents the transcription of a statement by the first person. So, that's my statement, right? And the second tone represents a second person repeating the statement of the first person. So, okay. Now, let's say you heard this though. Now, did the second person believe the first person? What would you say? Ed is shaking his head. Okay. So I used that again, that association, that projective imagination into that space of human character and emotion, feeling. I had them switch into that into that affective perception, and then describe the relationship, what the second person felt. And of course, I did it all in randomized order. And after the experiment, I took statements by the subjects, which were again graduate music students, and I reassembled it by the actual width of the interval that they heard. So when there was a little sharp, both these people said that they were really convinced the second person really believed the first person. With a little bit of extra energy, it says here. So yes, he really believed it. Whoops. I haven't learned how to use this thing yet. But now let's look at how the imagination was affected by the width of the interval. Here, at 1204 cents, this person said the second speaker was just a little bit less assured. At 1200 cents, the same person said, the second speaker is a little less assured. At 1196, the second speaker is not quite as sure. At 1192, the second speaker clearly not as confident. At 1188, the second speaker emphasized the negative. At 84, the second speaker was negative, discouraged, and disgusted. And 1180, the second speaker, weakest so far, but with hostility, clearly not so sure. The other participants said, starting to border on countering the first, focused against it. So here is an example where the same music students who produced the nice psychophysical curves, once they transferred into this projective imagination, produced finely graded emotional descriptions of interactions between people that were just as finely graded as the psychophysical curves. Helen Bonney was a wonderful person who inspired me to do that experiment. She was an American violinist by training. I think she went through Oberlin. Then she married, had kids, I gradually became interested in psychology, started a psychology counseling PhD. But that was after she had an experience, and this is a description of the experience. It'll be in the slides that I pass out. Where, when she was asked to play for a small gathering, her violin started playing almost by itself in her experience. The most beautiful sounds I ever heard, not mine. My fingers moved as usual, but the sounds were ethereal, out of this world. And then they asked her to play another piece. Actually, the person asked her to play, asked everyone to meditate after that because the experience was so extreme. But she said this had a very profound experience on her life, and that led to her eventually considering how to use this projective imagination, this experience of emotion in music therapy. So the Helen Body method, guided imagery through music, is still used by some music therapists as an adjunct to depth psychology. So instead of the Freudians using dreams to bring up, for the patient to bring up conflicts that they experience through dreams, Helen would give a person a carefully selected classical piece of music to listen to. And before listening to it, she would say, imagine you're in a forest or in a field. It's a beautiful day. Imagine that you feel the sun in the trees. And let the music take you where it will. So actively using this association that Myers talked about to let the music, the feelings put into the music by the composer and the performers to guide the subject's guided imagery. And then afterwards recount that to the therapist and use that as material to discuss deep-seated problems and feelings that this client had. I tried that method a little bit. I played some of those pieces, and the effects can be quite extreme. Of course, it's a form of hypnosis. It's on the way to hypnosis, suggestion, or auto-hypnosis. But this breaking into this affective mode of perception, which requires actually canceling the objective mode, really can lead to a very dramatic experience of music, emotionally. Now, if I'm a composer, which I am sometimes, how do I put affect into music? How do I put feeling into music? Well, I can use, of course, melody, harmony, rhythm, articulation, timbre. As a performer, I can use gesture as well. I want to focus now on just harmony and the roots of harmony. We've heard about this. We've heard about the string and its harmonics and harmonic series that are in all tones. The octave, which is used in music as musical equality in every music culture of the world, so far as the ethnomusicologists wrote when I was studying this. The perfect fifth, which is actually a ratio between the third and the second harmonics. It's called the fifth because it's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, sa, re, ga, ma, fa. The major third, which is the ratio between the fifth and the fourth harmonics, which is the third because it's do, re, mi, 1, 2, 3. If you actually make a fabric of these perfect relations, moving 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 3 over 2, and then multiplying again by the frequency, the tonic frequency by 3 over 2 and 3 over 2, you can imagine bringing it down by octaves as you need to, so it doesn't escape into the musical stratosphere. Or going by 5 over 4 and 5 over 4, 5 over 4. What you get is what I call the harmonic web, a harmonic fabric. In this fabric, major chords are upward pointing triangles, minor chords are downward pointing triangles. Peter showed us yesterday this fabric. And he also showed us that, so this is multiplying, essentially bringing in a factor of 3. This is dividing by 3. This is multiplying, bringing in a factor of 5, multiplying by 5. and dividing by 5, and of course reducing by octaves as needed. So this would be multiplying by 5 and dividing by 3. This would be multiplying by 3 and dividing by 5. And the relationship to our tempered scale, our 12-note tempered scale, is given by the distance from this line, basically. As you multiply, the fifths here are just a little bit sharp. As you multiply by fifths, the perfect fifths become a little sharp, but the thirds are really quite far off. The just third is rather flat compared to our equal temperament. So this is the compromise that Peter also talked about in other speakers. So in fact, you can take intervals that are almost perfect fifths or thirds, and you can identify them. So the 2 plus plus here at the bottom and the 7 flat minus minus, as I annotated here, are almost a perfect fifth apart. And the 4 plus plus, there should be another plus there, 4 plus plus and the 7 flat plus plus, again, are almost a perfect fifth apart. So if you take this row and fold it up and stick it there next to the top row, and that produces this roll here. You see the roll. Then now you have a cylinder. The fabric becomes a cylinder, and then you take this row and you make it a perfect, almost perfect fifth against that row. And now this cylinder turns into a torus. And here's the 53-note torus. Now, why 53 notes? Well, it's because of those coincidences. 4 minus is almost a perfect fifth above 6 flat minus, and so on. Those don't occur everywhere in this fabric. These are mathematical, arithmetic facts. So that in fact, the only kind of torus you can make without these seams being very strongly disjunctive, right? So all the fifths being almost perfect, these are perfect, and this being almost perfect. The only numbers of notes in such a torus are 53, 31, 12, 7, and 5. So in fact, the 12-note scale, the chromatic scale that we use, the 7-note diatonic scale that we use, and the 5-note pentatonic scale that we use, all are the mathematical solutions. They form what I call here a tone group, because a torus, on the torus movement, I think of it as an operation, and the torus is closed under that operation. Under musical movements by fifths and thirds, this is closed. So in fact, there is also a very beautiful arithmetic reason why there's a beautiful fact about the systems that we use in music, that they have this mathematical completeness property. So for instance, these are almost a tritone, right? And if you wrap the torus around this way and that way and that way and that way, what you come up with is a torus with the 12 notes, and so on. Okay, now I'm going to talk about affect. Affect, there's a whole rich world of affect, but how many dimensions does it have? And of course, with the rise of factor analysis, people began asking this. This is Plutchik, and this is his emotion space, where this is intensity. So going from sort of reflectiveness to pensiveness to sadness to grief, from apprehension to fear to terror. This is so inwards in his model is intensity, and then there's 2 axes here, two dimensions of variation among emotions that capture not certainly all the variance among emotions, but a good deal of it. And that was first shown by, I believe, by Osgood in the 50s, where he asked people to say, well, how far is sad from bored? And then how far is sad from excited? And of course, people would say, well, that's pretty far. And then they'd say, that's pretty close. And he took all those judgments, numeric judgments, and he put them into multidimensional scaling, projected it down to 2-dimensional space, and it always came out like this. And the 2 axes that he found, or he preferred, I mean, you can rotate axes here, or what he called potency and evaluation. Evaluation was valence. These are good emotions, these are bad emotions, people say. Potency is, these are strong emotions, these are weak emotions. Things like contentment would be down here. So evaluation of potency or valence and energy were the two predominant factors that came out in people's judgments of these words, whether in this culture or he tried it in other cultures, with a laboratory quality IBM card reading monster computer, of course. So I discovered in Harvard basement musical library back in the 1980 around, or earlier than that, 78. Odd Frenchman, man who lived in India, Alain Damuru, and his theory of interval affect, which knowing about Osgood, I could recast in this framework. That as you move here, the affective quality of these pitches, of these notes in relation to the tonic, imparts qualities of activity or potency. Whereas these, going in this direction, implies passivity. When you listen in this affective mode of projective imagination. This axis represents increasing sympathy, or sympathetic, person being sympathetic to feelings. And this is something like unsympathetic, obdurate. What this says is that there's this fabric of, this affective fabric, this primary two-dimensional manifold, in which we judge relationships between affect words, at least, and that has a systematic mapping, unexplained, but onto the space of musical intervals. And this explains the systematic power of a composer to convey affect through placement, through introduction of single notes. Again, separate now from rhythm and all the other aspects that a composer has at his disposal. So I might very much would like to try an EG experiment on this. Oh dear. So let's try an thought experiment right now. Now imagine that as the tonic, as the calm center of the person. Now each of the tones I'm going to add to it, think of them as reflecting the personality, the character, or the feeling at the moment of a person. So who is this person? What are they feeling? What is their character? Some words, adjectives. Somebody has. What did you imagine for this person?
Introvert.
Huh?
Introvert.
Introvert.
Sad.
Sad. Huh?
Planning.
Planning. I get quiet strength, confidence, quiet confidence. Now what about this person? Who is this person? Is it a man or a woman? Doesn't matter, whoever you imagine. What is this person feeling? Tenderness. asking about the music, I'm asking about the person. What is the person feeling? It's a mode of perception. It's hard sometimes for someone to flip into. But once you're into it, it's very spontaneous and immediate. And it's the mode of perception I would posit that the listeners, that Myers interviewed. What about this person? What does this person feel? Troubled? Are they also sensitive? Bleeding? We'll try one or two more. This is quite well. Now these are just tuned intervals, so somehow these effects seem to be more pungent or potent. What about this person? What is this person feeling? What's the exact character of this? What does this person feel? Uneasy. But are they resigned or are they determined? Subversive. Okay, of course all the answers are correct. You're describing what you're feeling. What feeling you what about this person? What does this person feel? What?
Bored.
Bored. Slightly helpless. Okay, so this is just a thought experiment. It's not science, but it's the stuff in which science can be built. If it's true that there is a natural fit between this scientifically established, predominantly two-dimensional space of relationships between different feelings, and a systematic relationship to the very basis of our harmonic structure, it has very strong implications for how harmony is able to be shared across cultures, across nations, across languages. About how the affective quality of musical harmony, harmonic variations, and harmonic, what should I say? The use of harmony, and including harmonic melodic relationships, is able to convey the same sort of emotion across cultures. So it's a very powerful hypothesis. So, okay, let's go to the next part of the talk. What is EEG? You found this beautiful picture. This is a sculpture. A sculptor in Europe makes clouds appear in gallery spaces. And I think it's fitting for EEG because most people don't really know what EEG is. They think it's something that goes on in there in the head somewhere that you can measure outside. It's certainly brain activity, but it's really only a small portion of total cortical brain electrical activity. But which portion? How is it triggered? How is it modulated? What functional significance may it have? So a primary fact about brains that is not true of our technology so far is that brain dynamics are inherently multi-scale, and that particularly goes for electrical recordings of brain dynamics. At each spatial scale, the signal produced is produced actually by active partial coherence of distributed activities at the next smaller spatial scale. So, if you were to measure from a bouton on a neuron, you would be measuring the confluence in time and space of molecular events. If you measure within a cell electrical potential fluctuations, you're measuring the concurrence and coherence within time and space of the thousands of synaptic events and extrasynaptic events. Similarly, if you record larger and larger fields from use larger and larger electrodes to record farther and farther away from the cortex, you're recording the synchrony in time and space of local field activities that form, in particular, that produce far field currents. Now, the reductionist science always would think this way. Oh, well, this is what's really going on. Or the physicists might say, well, it's the quarks that's really going on. And these are just epiphenomenon. Nobody cares. They don't real. This is the real brain at work is this, or the real brain is this. Of course, some people might say, might claim the real brain is that, but. Recently, though, it's been quite clearly shown that local field dynamics, cortical field dynamics, feed back onto the timing of spikes in neurons. And therefore, timing of messages, the quality of messages going out to distant areas, and therefore can affect brain dynamics, including learning and plasticity, at all spatial scales. So there's a mixing of spatial scales in the electrical activity of the brain. The basic models of cognitive dynamics, cortical dynamics, do not have this in it yet. But it's been, in recent years, it's been established. And which means that there is no totally epiphenomenal, there's no epiphenomenon here. These are all functionally related to each other and functionally affecting each other. The cross-scale coupling is bidirectional. Now, of course, the origin of EEG fields in cortex is known only in part. It's extremely complex. There's excitatory and inhibitory neural contributions, and the linkage between those is very important to sustaining potentials and oscillations. There is sparse cortical connections that can also support oscillations. There's my mentor Lambos believed there was neuroglial coupling, which of course has been shown in recent years. Edelman talked about value system modulations that are known to modulate the spectra in the cortex. Those would be dopamine, acetylcholine, et cetera, et cetera. And then there are this feedback of field activities on the action, on the dynamics within the neuron that's been discovered or rediscovered just recently. And finally, of course, the very important cortical thalamic loops that also play an important role in sustaining oscillations. The field dynamics are not single dipoles. The dipoles actually have depth. They're between various layers of cortex. If you record this way, this may not be available from this knowledge may not be available from surface EEG, although let's see in the future. So therefore, macro field dynamics, or rather importantly, micro field dynamics are spontaneously emerging dynamic patterns in complex nonlinear media. So here's a nonlinear medium, outer space, and here's a spontaneously emerging dynamic pattern, a galaxy. Here's another picture. This was taken by a home telescope. NASA called the guy up right away. How did you get this? This is the sun. And you see the multi-scale dynamics. At least every voxel here is 240 square kilometers. So, yeah, but I imagine, and I think the physics would say that if you went in and looked and blew that voxel up to the size, you'd also see multi-scale dynamics. You see a sunspot. You see phenomena at various scales here. Now, is there a picture like this for cortex, electrical dynamics of cortex? No. It hasn't been possible. It will be possible with the Obama Brain Initiative for the recommendations for scientists and NSF and the NIH panels. Both included ultra-high density ECOG, so it will be available. The pioneer in doing such work is Walter Freeman, or was Walter Freeman. He's still emeritus at Berkeley. He put in small grids, 8x8 grids on the smooth cortex of rabbits, and recorded the random phase portrait of electrical activity under those electrodes. Was replaced at key moments when the rabbit sniffs something new, for instance, with expanding waves or sometimes contracting waves. He likened them to pond ripples. At Plentz and Beggs at NIH, from the nonlinear dynamics perspective, referred to these as circular avalanches, repetitive circular avalanche events. This is what's required to create a cascade of current that doesn't cancel itself out at distant electrodes, for instance, on the scalp. So when you're looking at EEG, you're really looking at such phenomena. Your signal is predominantly caused by, has to be predominantly caused by such phenomena. Otherwise, if there were no local coherence, islands of no local coherence, the incoherence of the numberless field domains would cancel each other out, and you'd see nothing at the scalp. So if there are these pond ripples or domains of synchrony emerging spontaneously in cortex, the basic fact of biophysics is that their cascade of current, not just from the positive axis, but also from the negative axis, will reach all the electrodes. And the electrodes will record the sum of all these events, plus, of course, non-brain artifact processes. So that's why EEG is thought of as a fuzzy brain imaging modality for all these years, and rightly so. Because of this problem, the point spread function is very, very broad. Yeah. This is supposed to be an under saltwater picture because the field lines don't actually go out otherwise. So the EEG fallacy, as someone called it, and the naive point of view by people who use EEG is that EEG somehow streams straight up out into the electrode from the cortex right below it. But that's a fallacy biophysically. That's far from the truth. Here is something much closer to truth. This is an actual simulation from an actual MR-based electrical head model. Zeynep, Ken and Char, my lab did it using your NFT toolbox. So she simulated synchronous activity across just 1 centimeter of parietal cortex in her brain, actually. And this is the projection to the scalp. Blue is negative, red is positive, green is 0. And you see there's only a small equator line on which this source doesn't project. It projects to all the electrodes. So every source projects to all the electrodes, to varying degrees. And let's hope this works. So I asked her to simulate 2 sources, one oscillating at 9 hertz and the other oscillating at 10 hertz. And then to plot their summed projection onto the scalp EEG. Okay, here are the two sources. Notice they're not moving. Well, what's happening to the summed field? And now they're continuing to go at their steady 9 hertz and 10 hertz. Now what's happening to the summed field? So if you put an electrode here and you say, oh my God, look what's happening. We have a frontal 9 hertz alpha that's... No. I'm not going to show the simulation where she put 30 of these sources. And I'm not going to show the actual EEG data where there's all that plus eye blinks and muscles and so on. But you see the problem with EEG is that the naive interpretation of the scalp channel, working with the scalp channels directly is a poor idea. What it leads to is phenomena that have very low signal to noise ratio relative to the actual cortical sources. So, 17, 18 years ago now, I found the paper by Tony Bell in Terry Sinofsky's lab about the cocktail party problem and the new approach in applied math, independent component analysis or blind source separation. And the paradigm is the cocktail party. There's a cocktail party and there's microphones recording each one, or cocktail party noise. And can you find the man's voice in this set of recordings without knowing that it's a man's voice? Without saying, well, let's track the resonances of the vocal tract. But just, can you separate these automatically? And some bright mathematicians figured out, yes, you can. And the trick is that the waveform time series coming out of his voice and the waveform time series coming out of the saxophone are independent of each other. They're not phase locked. Even if he's singing the same song he's playing, they're not phase locked. So they're independent of it. You can't tell from the pressure at an instant here what the pressure at the same instant is there. So by driving the unmixing, the linear unmixing toward greater and greater independence, so you will arrive at the only two information sources available that created these recordings, the original sources. So I read that at 3 in the morning and I thought, what about the brain? Would it work? So you have the same thing. These are recording the sums of all these projections. And it's also instantaneous here. The time delays here create an extra mathematical problem. So perhaps we could recover the time courses at the source level of these source phenomena and their independent projections to the scale. So that was the claim. We put in a paper a week later. Who's the NIPS conference, and its claims have held up actually. So why should the domains be independent? Well, there we go to neurophysiology. Again, we said that the relationship between the excitatory and inhibitory neural populations were important for creating and sustaining oscillations. The inhibitory populations have no long-range processes at all. This alone should mean, these two effects alone should mean that synchrony should spread through a connected region of the cortex. As Freeman saw, the cortical connections are extremely sparse. They're 1,000,000 times less. If you go out a centimeter from a given neuron, the other neuron is 1,000,000 times less apt to be connected to the first neuron than a neuron nearby. That alone should mean that if these and the thalamic cortical couplings, which are also so important in sustaining oscillations, are predominantly, although of course not completely, radial. These facts, these basic neurophysiological facts, means that when these islands of synchrony, if they appear, should be largely independent because the connections between them in most cases are much stronger. And of course, mathematically, the signature of such a source should be that it has an equivalent dipole. It has a projection to the scalp that looks exactly like a tiny battery located in the middle of the patch and oriented normal to the surface. Now, of course, there's some white matter tracks that like corpus callosum, that connect patches of cortex. If they went into resonant activity, supported by this bidirectional coupling, then of course the projection of that affected source would be two dipoles projecting to the surface of the head. So what can you do with this? So you can, first of all, you can find non-brain sources. This is eye blinks within a session. This is lateral eye movement, saccades. This is a muscle activity. This is the muscle. I believe this was a little co-registered wrong. It's the insertion of the muscle that represents the polarity reversal. So this is this muscle. You can look it up in the anatomy textbook, I believe. And you see during the experiment, it was tense and then it became weak, relaxed, and then it began tense and relaxed. We're not usually aware of these sort of things, but I think that these carry a lot of interesting information, cognitive information as well. And finally, here's a heart blink, ECG, which actually goes into all the channels as well. In that same session, though, the ICA could resolve these sources with this telltale dipolar signature that almost perfectly represented by a dipole located in the cortex. Or sometimes dual dipoles here symmetrically located with respect to the midline. And again, extremely well represented. This was a 256 channel recording, so the 1.1% is overall 256 channels. So now it gives us the ability to look at processes with very much higher signal-to-noise ratio. Individual cortical processes up to 20 or 30 at a time. Then you can look at their transient interrelationships. You can look at changes in their spectral activity and so on as a function of events, both in some sort of average mode or actually in real time. So we're finding this is very effective for brain-computer interfaces. Now, can you actually find the patch that generated these? Well, here in an ECOG, this is electrocorticography. This plastic sheet was put on the cortex of a person. We found it by running ICA on this, some length of data collected from a patient. This, of course, was preoperative implantation into an epilepsy patient to plan epilepsy surgery. But we found this source here, which projected diffusely with one polarity to these electrodes and with the opposite polarity to these electrodes, meaning that it had to lie in the sulcus and oriented not radial to this grid. Something that neurologists really have never been able to understand, how they could record from the sulcus, how they could actually monitor the activity of sulcal sources from these grids. But here we show that it's possible, and we can actually estimate the patch that would support this in that person's own cortex by a very elaborate and adequate electrical head model. Can you do that for EEG? Well, we need at least an anatomic MR image from the subject, accurate electrode co-registration, of course, and a good skull conductivity estimate. It turns out that this is the most difficult part. And we're working on how to do that now from the EEG data itself. And so one can find estimates like this, in which this gives exactly this patch, which was found by a component analysis as to be an independent component process in the data. So I think it is possible to do true electrocortical imaging from EEG. It's going to be EEG informed by subject MR images. If you want to stay at the level of the equivalent dipole, which is near that patch, the equivalent dipole that would produce this is more or less in the center of that patch. Then you can continue to do EEG without recording MR images, anatomical head images, and making an electrical head model. But in future, I think that people will routinely get electrical head models made so they can participate in EEG experiments or clinical monitoring, and an adult image would last until your head was changed. So, some of you may know we have started producing EEG Lab, a software platform or environment in which all sorts of toolboxes you can plug in. These are toolboxes we've made, elaborate ones for BCI and Granger causal source level interactions and head modeling and so on. But of course, there's a two cultures problem in psychology, because not enough psychology students still are learning the quantitative basis for even using such tools. That's something that the education system is very slow in catching up to. Recently, a faculty appeared to give his job talk at UCSD Cognitive Science, and it was about new machine learning on fMRI data. So I asked him at the end, I said, well, how do you expect your psychology or your cognitive science students to learn to work with you? How will they learn the mathematical techniques you're using? And he said, oh, Coursera, of course. He didn't even think that the department or the university would supply that education to them. They would have to learn on their own. So that's the problem that with the emerging change in what the necessary skills are for doing this kind of for doing brain imaging or a whole range of other kinds of work. There's a large educational challenge, and it's for the universities, but it's also for the individual graduate student in hint. So EEG Lab is now used all over the world. Now, because we talked a lot about mismatch negativities, they were used to good advantage by Laurel and other people here. I thought I'd just put in a couple slides about our recent work with Greg Light, UCSD Psychiatry, who recorded mismatch negativities, passive duration mismatch negativities, short, long tone, occasional longer tones interspersed between shorter tones while they watched the cartoon, as the usual paradigm. But these were schizophrenia patients and controls. So these were adult schizophrenics and controls. And this is the data, you know, the same. This is the response to the standard at all the channels and the response to the deviant at all the channels. Here's the difference wave that we saw yesterday as well, with its features that are characteristic. And the mismatch negativity is the first portion of it. And of course, the phenomenon is that schizophrenia patients show smaller mismatch negativities. So we went to explore why this was. We used ICA, and we used ICA clustering of individual ICA solutions across all the subjects. And we found 6 clusters that were of sources that were present in both the schizophrenics and the normals. And they explain these portions of this difference wave between what we're calling the auditory deviance response. You see, they all explained a triphasic. They all had a triphasic contribution. It wasn't that one was early and one was late. And and if you look where they were located in central and frontal, mainly in central and frontal cortex, except for one parietal source here, or temporal source actually, superior temporal. And they were not auditory cortex. This duration didn't generate a contrast in auditory cortex. These were response to the deviance. This is deviance minus standard. So this is the decomposition of sources that ICA has given us. Now, when Greg Light took these source waveforms, he measured these 3 peaks in these waveforms. Very simple analysis still, ERP analysis still. But he now correlated them with all the symptom scores he had for his schizophrenics. For the first time in his life, these individual peaks in individual clusters explain different symptom scores. Half of negative symptom, variance in negative symptoms, half of variance in positive symptoms, half in severity, you know, life skills, half of, you know, various IQ-like measures that he had for the subjects. So the sum at the scalp, you know, the most negative channel, which would be FC usually, gave almost no correlation with any of those scores. But for the first time, the signal to noise given by the source analysis gave biomarkers that we can now use to study the landscape of schizophrenia or other diseases. He applied it recently to, this is all work, hasn't been published yet. He applied it to using training in auditory acuity in the style of Talal and Merced. As a pilot experiment, he just gave 1 hour of training. He gave this mismatch negativity test before and after this 1 hour of training, where they tried to increase their auditory temporal acuity. Did it go up or down? And what did we find? Well, the mismatch negativity didn't change much. This, again, is the difference wave. It didn't change much. If anything, it got smaller. But look what happened in the anterior cingulate component. It got much smaller. And look what happened to the orbital frontal component. It got much larger. And these then, so here is the interaction. And these then are candidates to look at effects of learning, predicting which subjects will be responsive to treatment and so on. So this is a very powerful technique, moving from the noisy and low signal to noise scalp recordings to the sources, gives EEG a power as a true brain imaging, functional brain imaging modality that's easy to collect and cheap and so on. Now, how did we use it to study emotion? Now we go back to emotion. So Julie Hansen worked with me for several years on all this. And we decided to use projective imagination, something like Helen Bonney, but without the music. We suggested 15 different emotions. So after a relaxation induction, relax, feel calm, We alternated positive and negative emotion inductions. And they were so what happened was the recorded instruction would be something like this. Now the next emotion you feel is you're angry, you feel very angry. Imagine something that made you angry in your life, or a situation that would make you angry. For instance, if you came outside and you found someone smashing your car with a baseball bat for no reason, or beating up an old lady on the street. Feel the anger in your body, feel the feeling in your body. When you're feeling it, push the button once and try to hold it as long as possible. After 1 to 5 minutes, they pressed the button the second time to indicate that it was waning. And then we gave them another relaxation induction. Now let it all wash away. Forget about that. Forget about those feelings. Now the new feeling, and we alternated positive and negative so it wouldn't weird people out. People were very surprised to report how well they could actually do this, how strong the feelings they could experience were. Only self-induced. And what came out was periods of EEG with no events from 33 subjects. So we made a model in which we looked at the modulation of the spectrum, the power spectral activity in the independent component processes, cartooned here. So we posited that there might be independent modulators that had a multiplicative effect on portions of the spectrum in one or more of these source areas. Here they're stuck into the brainstem. Of course, one candidate is, in fact, these brainstem-based evaluative system, dopamine, etc. But of course, we didn't build this in the model. This is just a math model. And they would have a multiplicative effect, and that allowed us to do a log linear decomposition, and again use ICA on the spectrograms to pull out. So what we got was very nice. It was different modes of spectral variation across time. So this shows the mean and the 90th percentile of the spectrum. For this independent component process. And the red shows alpha and a harmonic, and the blue is a broader beta. So these are spectral modes. Here is green is the lower lower frequency alpha and its harmonics. Blue, higher frequency alpha, which was alternating. So we could then look at these modal, the activity of these modes in the different emotions. And we picked a mode that I don't think I showed here. It was a mode that was characteristic for these components that began around 30 hertz and went to about 200 or higher hertz. I call it high frequency broadband. So it's not just gamma, but it's high frequency broadband. It was a very characteristic mode for these components. We found out that the most information about the emotion they were experiencing came in those modes. So when we looked at this high frequency activity in the power and the high frequency activity in the different emotions, we used across 33 subjects. We used multidimensional scaling to find out which states were near to each other, projected it down to a two-dimensional surface, and this is the curves we got. So of course we didn't. This was blind to what these labels were. So what we found was the dynamic state of grief and sadness was very good. So when they imagined sadness and then separately they imagined grief, it went to almost the same dynamic state. So you see these basically negative emotions and the positive emotions. If you project it down to one dimension, you get almost perfectly what a separate group of subjects rated the valence of these emotions. They rated, these as positive emotions and these as negative emotions. But their actual quantitative ratings were almost correlated 0.96 with this reading only from the high frequency portions of the EEG. People have discounted the possibility of getting high frequency EEG out of scalp EEG. But here's the proof.
Scott, so this is an MDS solution of some difference measure. What's the actual difference measure?
This would be differences in the high frequency activity in independent component processes.
Differences in frequency, differences in amplitude?
In amplitude, because this is very broad band, there's no frequency differences. And the only one out of place here is compassion, and that's, we asked them what they were imagining when they imagined compassion. Oh, they said, we imagined it was a terrible accident, and we felt so, bad for people. We felt so compassionate for them. Well, so it wasn't so inaccurate after all. We looked at what spots in the brain, the component processes in what spots in the brain really loaded heavily onto this valence emotion, good, bad emotions. And we found negative was in lateral occipital or secondary visual cortex. And I imagine this is because if you're imagining something like fear, you're imagining the tiger approaching, your visual system is very active. So the more active, high frequency in these sources, the more negative your emotion. Whereas if you're imagining awe, your eyes tend to defocus right here physically. And in imagination, you're not using high frequency visual features. But the positive valence, the positive correlation with valence was in high frequency activity here in temporal cortex. And I looked in vain in the brain imaging literature to find this. Recently, though, I found a PhD dissertation in which they actually used music as emotion inducing. And that they found that valence, when they used sounds, and they found that valence was positively represented here. So it's a very, very nice for me result that what we found in EEG was not separate from the brain imaging.
So did you take into account that subjects might also be like having muscle activation for?
Yes, so the muscles give a similar type of EMG profile. But of course, ICH separates out from muscles. So we looked at the correlations of the muscles to the sources, the brain sources, and they were not biased toward positive. That's an important question, though, of course. So I decided to apply this. I was asked to produce music for after-dinner music for the International Brain-Computer Interface meeting in Carmel, 2010, where all the brain-computer interface scientists, most of them were focused on communicating with ASL patients. Few people in the world are cognitively intact and locked in. The English physicist is almost at that stage. And so, of course, for 20 years or so, WOPA here in this country and increasingly engineers around the world are jumping into this brain-computer interface. But what they tried to do is give these people email. One letter a minute, but I mean, if you have nothing else you can do, that's wonderful, actually. But I decided to let them know that they could also read the emotions of the patients directly. They could translate the emotions into sound, into gesture, into, which of course would also be important for quality of life of these people. So what I did is I used the emotion guided imagery through music paradigm. This is our trio of musicians, or in one case would-be musicians. And here's our brainist. And in the pilot, and so the brainwave data went to the BCI computer, manned by Christian Kota. And then the output, to classify which emotion he was feeling, associated with which he spontaneously associated with a given chord, very much like the chords we listen to. And then once that classification was made, the appropriate chord was sounded as a ground bass. And then we musicians had to play the piece for that interval that I'd written and to conform to the character of it. And so here was the piece I wrote for the major seventh. You see 15/8. And unfortunately, we didn't get a live recording. It wasn't any good at all. So this is just the Sibelius. So you can hear dimly in the bottom the 15/8, the major seventh drone. And then this is the piece I wrote to accompany the feeling of the major seventh. Again, this is just the Sibelius score writing program that's playing the music from the score. So you see, in fact, 5 out of 5 were recognized correctly. He's out of the feeling. I asked him to feel the feeling of the person who was shy and sensitive in that case. He described that interval as being a person who was shy and sensitive. So I said, remember the person who's shy and sensitive. He went into the memory of that person and his or her feeling. And then the computer read the EEG and selected that word. So, how much time do I have left?
20 minutes.
Okay, so again, as a composer, how can I communicate effectively or communicate? Well, I certainly can use rhythm. So how do we perceive rhythm? Well, we can apply this source resolved EEG technology to perception of rhythm. And John Everson has joined the lab, and he's done this kind of work for about 10 years. And so we've resuscitated data collected by a student 10 years ago under my direction for a rhythm experiment. And we've recently applied these methods to it and have very nice preliminary results. So of course, there's some innate connection between rhythm and physical activity. You know, we all know that. And there's various aspects of rhythm. It's really quite complex in itself, including the sense of hierarchy as comes in the metrical organization of rhythm. And there's been fMRI studies on the various areas that involved in rhythm perception, including motor areas, even in the absence of overt movements. So I performed in the lab a tapping experiment. And we used click-based, or in some conditions, self-based tapping. Just tapping on a pressure button. And performing a piece, a rhythmic piece. It was a regular isochronous, that means single time interval tapping, regular steady tapping, but that alternated two musical meters, regularly switching back and forth between them. So this would be called experimental metrical modulation. And this was the structure of the piece. In fact, let's learn the piece and play it right now. Okay, so we'll play it like this. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 3, 1, 2, 1, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1. Okay, so now what are you experiencing, those of you who are musical, at the boundary, the disjunction between the meters? I don't know, what I experience is some sort of lifting feeling. When you go, especially when you go from 4/4 to 3/3/2, all of a sudden you have an accent, excuse me, after 3 beats instead of 4, and you have this. You certainly have a reorganization. It's a complex cognitive process that produces this performance of a simple piece. And there's the metric modulation. So you have bars in which there's repetition but no modulation, and then bars in which there's metric modulation. Of course, both of these add up to loops. So these are just 8-beat phrase patterns. And, so we had them play it, I think, 16 times. In a session. When we didn't have a click track, they gradually got slower, as everyone finds in click in spontaneous beat experiments. And then, of course, we found source clusters of the EEG. So we decomposed here those that were following a click track, but the click track didn't have any accents. They had to provide the accents themselves. And here was the ERP. to that piece in this source cluster. Now notice where this source cluster is: medial cortex, central medial cortex, and look at this 4-4 here. Notice that after every beat and after every 4 and every 2. So if I were to translate this into some sort of amplitude measure, I would go bump, 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 bump. So the brain in this area, the EEG coming from sources in this area, is following very regularly this beat, including this substructure, which was not specifically indicated, and which, as a musician, I wouldn't feature. I wouldn't go 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3. I would go 1, 2, 3. But the brain was organizing itself. The brain, that means the EEG activity emanating from sources in this area across our 8 subjects. And in the 3-3-2, the same: 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2. So here we have the metric structure of the EEG induced by this production experiment. But in the same cluster, when we looked in the spectral domain, now we found the data. We found the data, this is about 20, I think this was, 27 hertz? No, 24 hertz. So this is about 25 hertz, this regular alternation with a minimum on the beat and a maximum on the downbeat and a maximum off the downbeat. So here are the downbeats. And then there was a lower frequency that only occurred at the downbeats of the 3-3-2 bars. But there was no sense of any sign of any metrical modulation cue here at all. There's no phenomenon that only occurred on these black lines and didn't occur on the gray lines. In other words, where the meter changed instead of where the bar was. So this source territory was not concerned with metrical modulation, but it was very much concerned with the beat structure and the rhythmic hierarchy. Again, we saw the 4 and the 2. But look at this anterior cingulate territory cluster. There may be an outline there, I would not kept, of sources. Here's where the time frequency and you notice only this following the metric modulation was there this activity in theta and higher frequencies. So this was very concerned, this portion of the brain was very concerned with metric modulation. And in fact, if you took these and subtracted those, then you get the metric modulation effect.
So can you back up a slide, please? Just a question about the blue spheres. Are those individual subjects? Or
yeah, those are the individual subjects sourced equivalent dipole location in a template model. And this is without MR imaging, so it's there's some, that's why you shouldn't make them tiny balls. You should indicate there's some uncertainty. But of course, these were clustered together based not only on their geographical similarity, but the fact that their temporal dynamics, both the ERPs and the time frequency, what I call the ERSP, the event-related spectral perturbations, were quite similar across the 4 conditions. So here we have, and when we did some simple statistics on that, we find that it's significant across even that small number of subjects. I think we're going to repeat this with more subjects. So, although this territory only a few centimeters away, they're both in the midline. Of course, Peter might recognize this territory as well. They showed very, very different relationships to very, very different aspects of the musical production in this case and experience. So I think the field of EEG studies, of source-resolved EEG studies of musical experience and production are wide open. And there's a great deal of interesting work. Also, any of you have any data from mismatch negativity experiments you'd like to gain more information about, I think what these studies I've shown today represent an avenue that you could explore. Now this is John's experiment. He did the following experiment. Bum, 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 bum. is what the subjects heard, but without accents. And he asked them to imagine that the first note had the accent, like da 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 da, or the second note had the accent, da 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 da. And then he found that a certain portion of the Makeig channels, that some places on the scale, in the beta band, they followed the beat, where the downbeat was. Very much like this sort of cluster we found. And then he did a very difficult experiment. This is really hard for me to do. He had to get college percussionists who could actually listen to this pattern. Bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum, ba-dum, ba-dum. And imagine that the beat was either, it's very easy to imagine that the beat is on the quarter notes here. Bum, 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 ba-dum, ba-dum, bum, bum. But try to imagine that the beat is on the first, it's on here. Da-da, da-dum, dum, dum, da-da, dum, dum, da-da, dum, dum. Okay, only percussionists really can do that very well at all. But they could. And then there's a following one where they imagine bum, ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum, bum, 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 ba-dum. And they did that in the Makeig machine. And sure enough, he found, now he's gone to this source resolution. And here's a couple of sources he's picked up at random. This is their projection to the Makeig array. And when you line them up, either according to the sound, when the note occurs, so the note occurs at time 0, or where the beat occurs at time 0, you find that this source is timed its activity. This is the ERP, I believe, is timed, no, this is, again, the beta activity, is timed to the beat, as we saw in our central cluster, and this was timed to the note itself. So these are all coherent when you align them to the note and not to the beat. These are coherent when you align them to the beat and not to the note. And when he looked at, he's doing this analysis now, when he looked at which of these clusters were markedly timed to the beat versus markedly the sound itself versus the beat, then he used the color and the size of the spheres to indicate that. He found naturally, of course, in auditory, in your auditory cortex, you had responses to the sound and then responses to the beat. But whether this was ERP or beta, I think this was probably ERP at this point because the beta is not that. Now you notice in the Makeig there's nothing in the middle. Why is that? Because Makeig is not sensitive to radial currents. So given EEG or Makeig, it's much better actually to use EEG because you get all the sources that reach the surface rather than just a subset. And he did a clustering, another form of clustering that we have associated with the EEG environment, EEG lab environment called measure projection. And here is clearly auditory cortex territory in which the evoked response to the sounds themselves were indicated. And then other territories, for instance, he doesn't get the midline sources, but off the midline in sensory motor areas where the beat was indicated rather than the source. So again, all this experiments can be done now. Now what about indicating music by gesture? Music and dance is emotionally connected through emotion, right? Not only connected through by staying on the beat, but connected by emotional expression. That's why people love to dance. They love to dance with emotional expression, inspired by the music, by the emotional expression in the music. Okay, so let's say we're cognitive neuroscientists. We want to study brain behavior. Well, what is the brain doing? Well, the brain is, there's 1 quadrillion synaptic events in your brain and my brain every second. So that's what the brain's doing. Right? 1 quadrillion per second, that's what it's doing. Well, how does that translate into coherent activity that maximizes its the output of the effects of it? Well, there are emergent macrodynamics that we can study non-invasively. With EEG, local field potentials, even spikes are a macrodynamic from this point of view. So there's these macrodynamics. We now can record with 1 million bits per second easily. EEG, MEG, volt, whatever. But the tradition in coming out of psychophysiology for psychophysical experiments or psychophysiological experiments is that behavior amounts to this. Reaction time every second or two. Choice reaction, A, B, target, non-target. Okay. So but again, if you want to study the relationship between brain and behavior, now you're in the situation where you have 1 million bits per second of brain activity and on the order of 1 bit per second of behavioral activity. So how far can you go with one experiment? Okay. You can learn only a few bits of information, and then you design another experiment. And so on and so forth. So that means the progress in the field of EEG has been, in particular, has been very slow. Combining the problem of not working at the source level with the problem of this mismatch here. And so particularly people, what they do is they take an average, they take a channel and they take an average, and then they can say, well, you know, the peak is 3 microvolts when I push the button in this condition, and 2 microvolts when I push the button in that condition. So, or when this sound appears or that sound appears. So it occurred to me gradually over several years that what's the solution to this problem? And the solution is to record behavior, fully record behavior that the brain is organizing. And now you have a big math problem. You have 1 million bits a second of EEG data or brain data, and you have 1 million bits a second, let's say, of behavioral data. Let's say you have video, you have motion capture, you have eye gaze information, you have psychophysiology, all streaming in together with this. Now you have a big math problem, but you could potentially make much more rapid progress if you use modern machine learning methods. And physiologically based, biologically based pre-processing in each of those data streams to put them into relationship to each other. And of course to external events. So that's never happened. Why? Because in all modalities with EEG, the sensors are heavy. You have to hold your head against something really heavy. You have to hold it really still. So here's fMRI. And even in EEG, people are so afraid of the confounding the confounds in the scalp channels of the eye movements, the muscle activity, and the brain activity that they have people look at a fixation spot. So, but of course, this is all very, this is brain imaging, right? But this is very highly artificial because the brain has evolved to during free movement in 3D space to organize our behavior and optimize the results of our behavior. But it occurred to me that brain dynamics had never been observed in situ. Right? I wouldn't start with modern dance, but even the simplest thing, what is the brain dynamics that supports me reaching for this and successfully picking it up? Or then you can also ask, what is the brain dynamics that involves me reaching for her something? Yeah. Now, brain dynamics in me, the brain dynamics in her. So the brain dynamics involved in action and social interactions really have never been studied. So it occurred to me that you could do that. So the concept I thought was important enough for an acronym. Mobile brain body imaging. There's the Moby underwear of the Japanese or the Taiwanese artist. Imagine. You wouldn't have to have so many spots, of course. But this is all a couple of years away, actually. You wouldn't even need full. So to record simultaneously during naturally motivated behavior what the brain does, be it high-density EEG, now mobile wireless wearable EEG, what the brain experiences versus sensory scene recording. You can record, a scene camera and audio recording. What the brain organizes, which are our body and eye movements, our psychophysiology. And then use evolving machine learning methods to look at relationships between these data modalities. and between, of course, context. Intention, context, task. So thanks to, particularly to Christian Kotha, a wonderful programmer, who developed the lab streaming layer software, which is available on the web, for synchronous multi-stream, multi-platform recording and feedback. We built with support of ONR, Office of Naval Research, Basic Research, grant a Moby lab. For instance, here's an experiment that the student is doing right now, throwing darts. Here's an application by our collaborator, Gideon Didier. This is a mother and her 3-year-old, and they're playing the bubble popping game, taking turns, while EEG is recorded from both of them, and crude motion capture of the head and the arm, as well as video, and that's all synchronized. So now the mother's talking, sometimes the kid talks as well, and is moving freely. So how can you analyze EEG in this situation, which for traditional EEG people would be terrifying? Gideon's design here was that when if he doesn't pop the same bubble as his mother, he doesn't get the nice pop sound. He gets the boing sound. Unfortunately, a lot of the kids like the boing sound better. But here is a paper again under submission, in which we find a class of components. This is from one child, but we have found a class of components compatible with a location in the central sulcus, and supporting what a 3-year-old's new rhythm, which is not 10 hertz, near 10 hertz as in adults, but at 8 hertz and 16 hertz in the 3-year-olds. And here's the very nice result that you see mu desynchronization, mu blocking, both when the child reaches to pop the bubble and when he watches his mother reach to pop the bubble. So even in these freely moving conditions with difficult, but in the hands, of course, of a developmental child psychologist, you can record source level activities from multiple sources. This is only one of the clusters that we recovered. So in the lab, Grace Leslie came, music student, 5 minutes.
Don't rush.
And a music technology student, musician herself, and I asked her but she wanted to do something cognitive for her dissertation. So I said, well, what do you want to really know? Good question for a person writing a dissertation, right? You shouldn't work on something you really want to know the answer to. She said, well, I'd like to know whether someone is really engaged in music listening or in music production. I mean, you know, you can, as in the orchestra, you can saw away and think about dinner. And so we worked on what that meant, and it clearly means, again, this emotional engagement, this affective, stream of affective perception. So is someone emotionally engaged in listening to music or in producing music? So the traditional way to just try to study this is by questionnaires or by sliders. I'm now feeling more engaged, I'm feeling less engaged. But of course, these are symbolic scales, dual tasks, which destroy the emotional engagement. So although results from those experiments can be interesting, I thought of a way to, and we looked for a way, in which to a person would naturally express their level of engagement. And we thought of a quasi-conducting paradigm. And then she found a clip, so this movie clip really fits exactly the paradigm that we had come up with. It's from a movie in the 60s. And of course the woman is trying to explain to her deaf friend what she's saying.
I wish I could make you hear. No, not like that. Can you really hear?
Okay? So she's expressing the feeling of the music that she is hearing. And here in the lab is a subject, a non-musical subject actually, or a non-musician subject, trying to do the same with some film music. It should have been rated on emotion by the Finnish group. You notice he's making these heavy movements. So he's trying to, so we told him, imagine your deaf friend is there on the other side of the screen, and she's seeing these movements. Actually, what she's seeing, or he or she is seeing, is a moving spot of light. So this was transduced in real time on a screen in front of him into a moving spot of light with a little tail. And you're trying to make that image convey the emotion of the music. And imagine that your friend is trying to experience what you're experiencing emotionally by looking at that. And we use two conditions. One is an engaged condition in which you're only doing that. And the second was a condition in which you were doing that, but at the same time you had this mental task, arithmetic task. So we expected, of course, people would start being mechanical. So we called it the less engaged condition. So these were pieces Grace picked from the Finnish group's library of rated scores. And they're, you know, quiet, nice ones, and or sad ones, and excited ones, and so on. And here is one of the animations. So we could look at the motion trajectories from the motion capture, and we could find out where this was the acceleration profile. So the color here is the acceleration. And then we could look at where the different emotional interpretations differed, because the shape was always the same. And so we were still working on the motion capture analysis, the analysis of the actual dynamic cues in the movements themselves that the performer in this case was using to convey the feeling. But Grace put onto SurveyMonkey, I think, one of these sites where you can sign up and be a subject in an experiment. And so here's the people who signed up. And she showed these spots, moving spot animations, for the actual fully engaged condition, and by the same subject in the less engaged condition. And sure enough, the group could pick them out with fair accuracy, which was the more engaged and which was the less engaged. So then she looked at the EEG. We did the source analysis. This represents a source cluster across all our subjects, or most of our subjects, in which and this was the normalized swing cycle spectral perturbation. Right? So this was the change in the spectrum, the average change in the spectrum through the swing cycle in the engaged and the less engaged condition for sources in this area. And we find the significant interaction. So this is a theta band burst that occurs immediately before the return cycle, and a lower burst that occurs at the onset of the swing cycle, or right in the person. Right. If you look in the fMRI literature for areas of this temporal-parietal junction, you find agency, trying to communicate to someone, or loss of agency. My cursor is going crazy. I'm no longer under the control of my mouse. You find emotional communication. So they were obviously they were trying harder. Well, I mean, in fact, they were trying harder to communicate in this condition than in that condition. So you can find, so this was a first study and a first analysis of a portion of the data of the study that brings together emotion. Well, not directly emotional, although we have the emotional connotations to still work on in the data. But this conveyance of emotion through gesture, in response to music listening, and recorded by this mobile brain body imaging with high density EEG, source resolved, and emotion capture. So thank you.
Since we began a little late, we're sort of nearing the end of time, but if you don't mind, we can have an abbreviated discussion. We have 5 minutes before we break.
Yes?
So just how did the activity kind of in TPJ in the last study compare to whatever you were seeing, I think, in temporal regions.
Yeah, it's not